Thank you very much to everyone who's joined us today for today's event. My name is James Brady, and I'm a committee member of British Pugwash, the organisation which seeks to provide a forum for scientifically informed discussion on nuclear weapons and an array of other existential risks to humanity. We're joined this afternoon by PJ Blount, who is the Assistant Professor of Space Law at Durham University. PJ's primary research areas are international space law with a focus on space security and cyberspace law and governance. He's published and presented widely on the topic of space law and has given expert testimony on space traffic management before the US House of Representatives Subcommittee on Space. His book, Reprogramming the World, Cyberspace and the Geography of Global Order, was published open access with International Relations Press in 2019. He's an editor of the Proceedings of the International Institute of Space Law and was formerly the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Space Law. He currently serves as the executive secretary of the International Institute of Space Law and is a licensed attorney with the State Bar of Georgia. We're delighted you could join us today, PJ. We're looking forward greatly to your presentation today. So I will hand over the floor to you in one moment. I would just ask, in terms of housekeeping, that anyone attending today's session, please keep your microphone muted. We will run today's session for approximately an hour. PJ's presentation will take approximately 20 to 25 minutes. And then we will go to the floor for questions and discussion of today's presentation. So without any further ado, I will hand over to you, PJ. Please go ahead.
Well, first, let me thank you for having me today. I appreciate the invitation. And now I get to try to share my screen. All right, and it looks like it's already in mode. So what I'm going to be talking about today is what I'm calling the coevolution of the nuclear space age. And so I want to kind of lead you down a narrative from the initiation of these two technologies and bring forward how they really are still intersecting even today. And I will say, right, I'm going to miss a lot of points on this timeline, right? I only got 20 minutes. But there are lots of places to stop in and say hello. But I want to kind of pull forward a handful of different threads that play into this and bring it all the way into literally this past month with some of the policies that we're seeing announced in the US. So let's see if I can change slides. There we go. You guys should all know what this is. I actually, every time I give this presentation, I mean to Google this and remember which one it is. I'm pretty sure that this is the first nuclear explosion at the Trinity test site. But as you all know, right, this is mid-40s. We see this used in 1945. And this was a dramatic thing for the world, right? Suddenly, the human race is showing weapons that are massively destructive. And the US, who was clearly the state that used these, attempted to adopt this notion, right, that nuclear technology should be used for peaceful purposes. And you'll find this in President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech. He uses this phrase over and over, the notion of peaceful uses. And this is not a phrase that is sort of foreign to international law. We see it used in lots of different contexts. But very specifically, what Eisenhower wanted to do was get nuclear ranked in this notion of peaceful uses. And he was trying to build a bridge with the Soviet Union and keep these from becoming the destructive weapons that they are. The Soviet Union was not on board with this, was very opposed to on-site inspections, which is part of what the Eisenhower plan called for, and really stonewalled this. And so we kind of lost out on this. Now, you can go and look at the treaties, and it actually, I think the NPT uses the notion peaceful uses, but not in the way that Eisenhower was pushing it in the late 40s. Now, this is Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush was the head of research and development for the US military during World War II. And I put Vannevar Bush up here because he wrote a book in, I believe, 1949. And it was called Modern Arms and Free Men. And there's just this most fascinating passage. In this passage, he says, we don't really need to worry about nuclear weapons. It's not a concern that we need to have. And he says this because at the time, to do a nuclear attack, you needed to take those weapons, You needed to put them on an airplane. That airplane needed to take off and it needed to fly over an ocean. And in all of this time, right, there is time to respond. There is time to stop this attack. When you get to the border of the United States, you have to go through a radar fence. You have to beat our Air Force. This is actually not an easy attack. This is a difficult attack. And so Vannevar Bush's opinion is that, look, they're big, they're destructive weapons. But because of the way that they work, we don't have to be concerned about them because we can defend against them, right? And that was, the reasonable position in the 40s. But then we get 1957. And 1957, we see the launch of the first human-made object into space, which is Sputnik 1. This is a model of it, not an actual photograph of it. I do like Sputnik. I think it's the coolest looking thing we've ever put into space. Great Art Deco design there, no notes. But Sputnik is another massive technological step forward, right? So, I mean, you can imagine the use of nuclear weapons in World War II and what that did to sort of the public psyche. Well, Sputnik did a similar thing, right? And there are two narratives that I think are worth noting when we talk about Sputnik. The first of these is that the Soviet Union kind of won the first step of the space race, right? Both the United States and the Soviet Union had announced in, I think, 1955, that as part of the International Geophysical Year, that they were going to launch a human-made satellite into Earth orbit. And the Soviets won this. They got there first. And so there's this part of it is, well, they won the first step of the space race. The other part of it, though, is what we can call existential dread, right? This showed the technology for an ICBM, right? That wonderful bit that Vannevar Bush told us about, how we don't have to be worried about this. Suddenly now you have to be worried about this because you've taken your attack time down from 11 to 12 hours to, a matter of a couple of hours at most. And this is much harder to defend from. And so we have this moment of, well, how is this going to work? What's going to happen? And this brings us to, sorry, I'm getting my presidents again. This is Eisenhower. This brings us back to Eisenhower, right? And the day after Sputnik, there is a meeting in the White House. And Eisenhower is furious. He's angry. And he has two questions, or he has one question. Right? Two things happen, but one of them is this question. He's like, could we have won? Could we have beat them to space? And somebody says, yeah, we could. We could. We have the scientist Werner Braun. He's down in Alabama. And Werner Braun, we are pretty sure, has the technology to put something into space. And Eisenhower says, well, why didn't he do it? Why didn't we have this guy launch something into space? Why didn't we win this race? And the response was, well, because Werner Braun works for the military. He is an employee of the Army. And we wanted to make sure that our first launch was one that was done by a civilian. It was civilian led because we wanted it to be, and we come back to that idea, for peaceful purposes. And so we see them resurrect this notion of peaceful purposes that failed in the nuclear context and apply it to space. And this is a very effective moment. And when the United States makes a decision not to win the space race because it is a military launch. Now, Werner Braun was immediately pulled out of the Army. All of this stuff was civilized and they launched pretty soon thereafter. But following up on this, the United States passes the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958. And in that, Section 102 says that it is the policy of the United States that space will be used for peaceful purposes. We then see this phrase spread amongst space governance documents. Every UN General Assembly resolution that has ever talked about space uses the phrase peaceful uses or peaceful purposes. You find it in the Outer Space Treaty. It is pervasive in the realm of space. And so that's one of the reasons why Sputnik went up before Explorer 1 did. I said that Sputnik was a really cool looking satellite. Explorer 1, the US's first satellite, which I don't have a picture of, was really ugly. It was a bad attempt at good design. But that's the first thing that we get out of this White House meeting is that, well, the United States at that time was very much focused on making this a peaceful endeavor and not making this a military endeavor. Yeah, sorry, I've talked over the slide that I've already given you everything I was going to talk about in this slide, so let's go to this other one. But immediately thereafter, right, both sides are like, well, let's see what we can do. And so we have these sort of crazy experiments going on. So Operation Argus is a nuclear detonation in space. The headline over there from the Arizona Daily Star is a Starfish Prime, in which the United States blew up a nuclear weapon in space. And they immediately learned that this is really bad, right? This creates an electromagnetic pulse. It burns up satellites. There's an apocryphal story that I love to tell. Nobody tell me if it's wrong, because I want to keep telling it, right? But that when Starfish Prime went off, that it actually fried not just US satellites, but it fried Soviet satellites too. So some poor soul from the US Department of Defense had to call Moscow and be like, hey, we're not trying to do war. We made a mistake in space. We didn't realize this would happen, right? And the other thing that you see here is next to this stamp are these little needles, and this was Project Westford, and this is when the United States decided they were going to launch lots and lots of tiny needles, thousands of them, into space, just to see if they could bounce radio waves off of them, which is not good for the space environment to have a bunch of small things orbiting Earth at super high speeds. But both sides, both the United States and the Soviet Union at this time, immediately began to experiment with nuclear weapons in space, and both sides came to the same conclusion: like, this isn't tenable, right? We can't keep doing this. This doesn't work because it creates a radiation field that fries satellites. It creates this electromagnetic pulse. This is not a good thing. Now, at that time, right, they also both realized that this was probably the best anti-satellite weapon you could have, right? Is to just detonate a nuclear weapon in space, because it then fries satellites. Great anti-satellite weapon. But nevertheless, they were able to come to agreement that maybe we should stop doing this. And that is expressed in the limited test ban treaty, right, which states that the state parties to that are not allowed to detonate nuclear weapons in space, underwater, or in the atmosphere. And the reason that they were able to come to that agreement is because these are really easily verifiable, right? You detonate something in space, everybody sees it, everybody knows, and as a result, like, we can verify that you did or did not do this. This is also why the limited test ban treaty does not include underground. At that time, there was no verification. But one of the reasons they could come to this agreement in space was because of the civil space endeavor, right? So this is like the first dog in space. But during these early years of the space age, the Soviet Union is just what I call dunking on the US left and right, with the firsts, right? The Soviets put the first human in space, the first satellite, the first human, the first woman, the first dog. I think they put the first mouse up there. They did the first spacewalk. They did these first one after the other, and they were really racking these up. And they were realizing that if both sides keep sort of pursuing these security goals in space, that the civil space mission gets damaged, because you put human spaceflight at risk. And they were both getting their best returns on human spaceflight at the time. So this early testing of nuclear weapons in the space environment pretty much eased up and went away. And in fact, testing of weapons in general eased up and went away. We have a couple of examples along the way, but both began to really focus in on this civil end of things. Now, I said that there were two things that happened in that White House meeting with President Eisenhower. And the second is this: a staffer in the room raised his hand, and there's a memo out there. You can go and read this. And he says, well, sir, they did us a good turn. And this is a really interesting statement. But what it's about is the freedom of access to space. So from a legal perspective, and I am just a country lawyer, but from a legal perspective, right, there was this notion, and we knew about airspace, right? We understood that if you flew a plane into another state's airspace, you have violated their territory. It is a challenge to their sovereignty. That is bad. We weren't so sure about space, right? We weren't sure whether orbiting something in space violated this notion of territory as well. And at the time, right, people were using there's a lot of Latin in law, right? One of the premier sort of Latin ideas is that when you own property, you own it all the way down, and you own the sky all the way above it. Now we've clearly backed down from that in strict sense, but there just wasn't clarity on this. And so what the staffer meant by "sir, they did us a good turn" is that as Sputnik began to orbit and to go over every state, and nobody protested, it actually established this legal notion that you can overfly other states in space. And this was really, really important to the United States. Because if we go back to that notion of peaceful purposes and that atoms for peace deal that Eisenhower pushed, well, what we get is the Soviets didn't want inspections. The Soviets wanted to hide what they had. Now, the US turned this into a missile gap that didn't exist, but the US had no way of seeing in, right? If you want to know how many nukes the US has, public information, right? You can go find that out. If you wanted to know how many nukes the USSR had, you had to spy. And spying was, of course, difficult. So Stargate did us a good turn is this acknowledgement of the fact that, well, maybe this can help us. And indeed, it could, right? So this is the U-2 spy plane. This is how we were gathering our intelligence over the USSR at the time. This is a very high altitude plane. It has all sorts of sensors on it, and it flies at such a high altitude that states generally sort of know that the U-2 is up there, but it's difficult to do anything about. It's hard to shoot down a plane at those altitudes. Nevertheless, the Soviet Union was successful at this. So this is Gary Francis Powers, and Gary Francis Powers was piloting a U-2 plane over the Soviet Union to gather intelligence, and he was shot down. As sort of trivia for you, you can use it in the pub quiz. The initial cover story by the US was, oh, he's a NASA pilot, right? So they linked him to civil space, right? The notion that this is for peace, and he was doing weather experiments. And of course, the Soviets are like, well, he's in an Air Force uniform. That's not going to cut it, right? But Gary Powers gets shot down. Gary Powers actually survives the shoot down and is the first spy swapped back to the United States in a spy exchange, right? So we had a very clever lawyer in the US that pushed this. And if you ever watch the Tom Hanks movie Bridge of Spies, Gary Powers is that first spy being swapped back. So Gary Powers gets shot down. This means that the United States needs to stop U-2 missions because U-2 missions are now a risk to the pilot. The Soviets have shown the capability to eliminate U-2s from overhead. So this is a problem, but space gives us an answer, right? And so the United States began its Corona program. The Corona program was a remote sensing program that was primarily geared towards gathering intelligence about what sort of munitions and weaponry the Soviets had, and very specifically, what sorts of nuclear weapons they had. Now, U-2 is actually, or the Corona program is actually better than U-2, right? An airplane gives you a small swath of land to look at. When you're overhead in space, you get big chunks of land, and you can buy and you can find all sorts of interesting things. In fact, Corona was critical in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Imagery that was taken from U-2s and from the Corona program was used to prove what was happening in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I said that during this time, right, the Soviets are racking up all these firsts in civil space, right? The US was okay with this because the US was pushing this type of military technology in the black. And so this was all hidden, right? There was no acknowledgement that the United States had this remote sensing program. Now, at the time, the Soviets were like, oh, that's illegal. That's a military use of space. You can't do that. But nevertheless, as soon as they got their own remote sensing capabilities, they sort of shifted their narrative around that. So Corona came along, and Corona did a great thing in that it actually allowed us to begin to verify disarmament agreements. And so in the 70s, we get the SALT I agreements, we get the ABM agreements, we get these agreements that are about measuring weaponry in the other state. And well, of course, we know that at the heart of any disarmament agreement is the notion of verification. How do you know that the other team is doing what they're doing? And so they wrote into these agreements this notion of national technical means, right? It sounds very benign. They're going to verify it with national technical means. And there's also an obligation to not interfere with the national technical means of the other state. Now, this was left undefined in the treaty and was really left to the states to kind of fill that in. Now we know in the late 70s, Jimmy Carter is giving a speech at NASA, and he lets slip in the speech what national technical means are. primarily they're satellites, right? There are other parts of infrastructure that are put in place, but these are satellites. And so we have now the means to verify disarmament agreements, right? And so this leads us to those ones in the 70s, but this gets pulled forward to the INF agreement, to the START agreement in the at the beginning of the 90s, right? And so this notion of national technical means is really critical. It allows states to say that they're going to verify and how they're going to verify it without being specific about it. And it also protects those verification means from interference. This is good when we're talking about space, right? It actually works to set up a framework where we're not constantly up there messing with other people's stuff. And in fact, here's an example. You'll see down there at the bottom some bombers, and those bombers have essentially, they took out a big guillotine and they cut the wings off of them. This is out in an Air Force base in New Mexico. I always forget the name of this Air Force base. Pretty sure it's in New Mexico or Arizona. But the reason that those are there is so a Soviet or a Russian satellite, because this is after the START treaty, so a Russian satellite can fly over, look down, and verify that those planes have been decommissioned out of the U.S. arsenal. Right? That's why they're out there in view. That's why we didn't take those and melt that metal back down. Right? They're there so that they can be verified. And so that's the sort of power that this technology brought along. Now, it would be so this is all baked into this notion of disarmament. Now, in the 80s, we had in the US the notion of the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, right? And this was at the heart of it. This idea that was called Brilliant Pebbles. And Brilliant Pebbles is the notion that you have a lot of interceptors in orbit, right? So they're going to get the nuclear weapon in boost phase. And so the missile defense program, or the missile defense idea, is that we have these up there. As the thing comes into space and goes into boost phase, this thing will then intercept it, right? The brilliant pebble will shoot down and get it. So it's an interesting idea, but the reason that SDI was never able to achieve this is it was really expensive, right? To get coverage of the globe that would actually protect you in the case of a nuclear attack, you would need a satellite system that looked like this. The figures are well over 1,600 of these. Now, in the 80s, this was an impossibility, right? The sheer cost of launch was prohibitive, much less the research and development. And so while SDI was talked about and talked about and talked about in the 80s, it sort of went away. And this notion of brilliant pebbles went away. Put a pin in that. We'll come back to that in a moment. We also have the demise of this notion of national technical means, right? This is John Bolton. He served under both the George W. Bush administration as well as under the Trump 1 administration. In these roles, he actually managed to get George W. Bush to withdraw from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and he got Trump to withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty and the INF Treaty, right? These were sort of the last treaties that had this notion of national technical means. I do think there is one more out there about fissile material that has it, but in that one, I don't necessarily know that they mean satellites, because it's much more about sort of what's on the ground. But we have this notion that national technical means is slowly going away as a bilateral obligation between the United States and Russia. And that causes problems, right? Because that opens up not just the problem that you might be rearming, that you might be redoing these stockpiles, but also the interference problem, right? So the obligation is not to interfere with national technical means. Well, now, if that goes away, you don't have a legal obligation under these treaties to not interfere. There might be other places that you can find that, but that is the trend that we're going on now, right? We have this question of peaceful uses versus dual use, because as we're thinking about the commercialization of space, well, we have to think about how certain civilian assets and certain commercial assets get repurposed into the security world. And I think on my last 3 slides, I've added them in here at the last moment. So I'm going to try to make this still the narrative here. But yeah, so this is Starlink, right? That should look a little bit familiar to you. I just showed you a constellation that was impossible in the 80s that kind of looks like this. And this is possible now. It's up there. And as we know, Starlink is a national security player, right? It was critical in the early stages of Ukraine. I don't want to even guess as to what role it might play now, but this is an important thing, right? So Starlink is able to build a constellation like this. Starlink is a commercial actor that is playing in the national security realm. So this is one sort of data point that we can think about, right? Well, we also have the US warning of a new Russian ASAT program, and that this would be a nuclear ASAT, something that would create an EMP on orbit, right? So now we have that notion of there's the ability to interfere, and they're putting that up there. And this would violate the Limited Test Ban Treaty, but it doesn't seem like these states are super concerned about violating a treaty anymore. So this is your other data point, is that Russia might be pursuing that core technology that we talked about in the 60s. And then we have our wonderful new president of the United States directing the building of an Iron Dome missile defense shield for America. Guess what this is built on, or guess what they're after here? Well, they're after brilliant pebbles technology. That's what they want to do. Now, if you put all these three together, you have an interesting place. You have Musk with the ability to put up the type of constellation. Now, I'm not a scientist or an engineer. I don't know what the difference in weight between like a Starlink satellite and a brilliant pebbles would be. But just the fact that you can get that many up there is interesting. You also have Trump now sort of resurrecting this idea, and you have Russia talking about, well, we need a weapon that's going to defend against that. So again, we're back to this problem where we're having this destabilization in space, but this destabilization in space is linked to the sort of current destabilization in the nuclear realm as well. So I think that's a really important sort of thing to hone in on. And I think that, yeah, that's my story for the day, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, PJ. A really interesting presentation, and I am confident that we'll have questions from our audience. I just ask that if you have a question for Dr. Blount, that you could raise your hand, and I'll come to you. We have enough time for a lot of questions, so I'm just looking to our audience. If you have a question, please do raise your hand, and we can get through maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time. So Peter, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Blount. That was a really interesting presentation, and very interesting to hear the kind of historical journey that you took us through. Just a question about the whole business of ballistic missile defense, which obviously you touched upon with the brilliant pebbles, the Iron Dome type scenarios that you mentioned. Is it not the case that these kind of defense systems are relatively easily overcome by an adversary, in as much as it's much cheaper to put together a greater number of offensive weapons, offensive launches, to overwhelm the missile defense system than it is to actually put up enough interceptors to make the system effective? So in that sense, are we not really just kind of chasing a dream if we think that we're going to have the kind of Iron Dome that has been proposed by certain people in the States?
Thank you very much, Peter. I don't see any other questions at this point, so PJ, if you'd like to take this question.
I'll go ahead with that one. And yeah, I'll note that I'm not an engineer or a strategist by any means, but I do agree. I think that this is my understanding of it as well, is that just the notion of it, I think they're called MIRVs, right? Multiple reentry vehicles. Yeah, you know, anytime that you fire at something like brilliant pebbles, you create a hole in it. And that hole is because you use up satellites, or you use up interceptors there. And so if you blast what is essentially, 10 of them up at a time, well, now you need to use 10 interceptors, and suddenly that is a hole in your defense. And so, yeah, I mean, there are lots and lots of technical challenges on this. The book that I usually send people to on this from the space end of things is there's a book, you can get it online for free. It's called The Physics of Space Security. And it actually goes into the calculations on how many satellites you need, how easily they could be overcome, and it's a fascinating book. It is a bit dated at this point. I think we're talking 20 years old at this point, but still really fascinating work there. But yeah, I mean, space-based missile defense is not a good investment of your money, in my opinion.
Thanks very much. So I will turn to Sarah, please, followed by Tim.
Okay. Hi,
Hi,
am I
Sarah.
audible? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Loud and clear.
perfect.
Go ahead.
I am Sarah Al-Sayed. I'm a Kendall Fellow with the Union of Concerned Scientists in the United States. I'm formerly a postdoc with Princeton University's Global Security Program, where I'm actually sitting right now. So thank you very much for the talk and the interesting narrative. So I'm familiar with a couple of space history pieces that that I would like to bring up in order to push back a bit on a couple of claims here. So I believe that you've cast the United States remote sensing aspirations towards the end of the 1940s as more benign than they actually were. And relatedly, I believe that you also like shed a more innocent light than necessary on the US efforts to frame its space activities or space aspirations in international fora, including the Committee on the Peaceful Uses for Outer Space. So you've cast them as way more innocent than they actually were. So I believe, relying on those sources, that it was years before the planned International Geophysical Year that the United States wanted to build surveillance or reconnaissance satellites. And you mentioned the quote, "Sir, you did us a good turn." The USSR did us a good turn. I think that was in reference to the United States finally being able to push ahead with plans, with the remote sensing plans, given that the USSR had already set the precedent of freedom of space. And it is not surprising, it's not a coincidence that the Corona reconnaissance satellite program was launched around the same year that the act that established NASA. So both coincided basically in time, and it was actually NASA was actually intended to be a kind of front for the military aspirations and programs, so space military programs and activities in the United States. So NASA was just the civilian front, but then the United States also went to great lengths in order to promote remote sensing as a peaceful use of outer space. So remote sensing as part of defense infrastructures was actually being promoted. Like this was a concerted effort, as far as I understand, from like emanating from a set of directives in the end of the 1940s in response to the Sputnik moment, etc. So a concerted effort by the United States here in order to promote remote sensing as part of defense infrastructure as a peaceful use of outer space in order not to provoke the international community, not just the USSR. This was happening in the Outer Space Treaty fora, so that the US could continue with its military space program, remote sensing and otherwise.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's it.
I might just ask if anybody else has any questions, we can take a couple questions at a time. But if not, PJ, if you'd like to respond to Sarah's comments.
So look, I mean, there's a lot of nuance here. And I'm not saying that the US is a benign actor at this time. I'm trying to trace a thread across history that we can follow. And I'll pick up just on the notion of peaceful purposes and this notion of remote sensing, right? My point is that within this context, right, the United States did exactly what you're saying that they did. They said that's going to be for peaceful purposes, and then they pushed this notion of remote sensing, which they then picked up with Landsat in '72 and said, "Oh, look, we're giving the world remote sensing imagery, and it's so nice, and it's wonderful, and it's fuzzy." But that's all in that concerted effort around peaceful purposes, because peaceful purposes to the United States at that time was the notion of non-aggressive, not non-military, non-aggressive. And in fact, there's a fascinating flip-flop if you follow Copious at the beginning. where the United States starts with non-military, and then they're like, oh, maybe that's not a good idea. And they move to this notion of non-aggressive. And so the Soviets are like, no, it's non-military. And then the Soviets are like, maybe we shouldn't do that. And they move to non-aggressive too. And in fact, today, I mean, you still every now and then see a handful of states say, hey, it's non-military. But right now, right, like non-aggressive is really where states are. And I have written a number of papers arguing that we're actually moving toward like sort of a bottoming out what peaceful purposes can mean, that it used to mean more than that. But look, the United States is not a benign actor during this time, but this notion of constructing the narrative is really important to how we see space develop, how we see space law develop, and how we see the military activities play out, because up through the 70s, it was really something that was in the dark and hidden. As we move into the 80s, it changes to, military is what we're going to do, and that's going to be our thing. And then we get all the way to today where, we're talking about putting brilliant pebbles up again. So I wasn't trying to whitewash the United States there. They did some very unpleasant things during this time, but that narrative across history and the way that the norm was shaped, I think is really important to understanding where we are today in space.
Thank you. Tim, would you like to go ahead, please?
Thanks, James. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, PJ, I was wondering if you could tell me your thoughts on the Paros Treaty, the proposed Paros Treaty on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. It seems like the US is opposed to it, but China and Russia support it. So I was wondering what politics are at play there. And secondly, you mentioned briefly at the end of your presentation EMP, which I understand to be an electromagnetic pulse detonation using a nuke in space. And you did that, mentioned that in the context of ASAT and satellite weapons. So I wonder if you could just expand a bit on what developments there have been with EMPs recently, and what states might be able to cause detonation in space, and why they might want to choose to do that, and if any arms control regimes could prevent that or control that. Thanks.
So let me take the second one first, because I can drone on about the first one for way too long. So EMPs, yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about how the technology is developed. We do have this claim by the United States that Russia is developing one, and pretty much, look, any state that has a nuclear warhead and a big enough rocket can do an EMP in space. And the question would be, well, that you asked, why would they want to? At this point, probably you're a spoiler state, or you're a state that's been backed into a corner, right? And so we could see a world in which, I don't know, 2 months ago, we could see a world in which Moscow gets backed into a corner and does something drastic, and that might be it. But, they lose a lot too in that scenario. Now, you can harden your satellite circuitry against an EMP and hope that it protects them, but that's not going to help most commercial satellites, because it costs too much, right? Starlink is not hardened against this type of technology. What types of arms control regimes, right? Look, the Limited Test Ban Treaty is what we sort of banked on for a long time. And then we have Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says, don't station nuclear weapons in space. But like, that's a fascinating moment too, because that's entirely unverifiable, right? There's no verification of that. The states just agreed because, well, it made sense at the time. So to be honest with you, I don't know what sort of breaks there are on that in the disarmament world, and this does link back over then to your first question, right? Do we see breaks coming? And there is a Canadian diplomat, Paul Meyer is his name, and he wrote this article, probably 10 years old now, where he starts, and there's always a risky thing in the space world to start an article and say, well, you know what, if aliens landed here tomorrow, that's how he starts it, right? He says, look, if aliens landed here tomorrow and they beam down into the middle of the prevention on an arms race in outer space discussion, they would be baffled, because you have every state saying, yes, we want this, but no state actually moving it forward in any real substantive way. And this was really, so I'll pick this up in the late 90s, right? And so really when we come, and I'm sorry to talk about the US a lot, I'm clearly an American, I'm much more versed in this, but like this plays out at the international realm. In the late 90s, the Clinton administration sort of had this policy, it wasn't written down, that we still need new rules for space, right? Everything was hunky-dory. Cold War ended. It was the end of history. A wonderful time in the 90s, right? When you get to George W. Bush, and George W. Bush adopts in the US space policy that we do not want any new rules, any new norms. We're not going to negotiate. We're not going to sit at the table. We're not going to talk about any sort of normative growth in the space world. We think it's fine. And so what this led to is the Conference on Disarmament becoming deadlocked. Conference on Disarmament was deadlocked because the United States would not agree to any program of work that had Paris on it, and Russia would not agree to any program of work that did not have Paris on it. And so you have this deadlock. Now, the deadlock came unfrozen in 2014, I think, during the Obama administration. The Obama administration said, fine, we'll have a program of work. At that point, Conference on Disarmament deadlocked on fissile material and is still deadlocked today. So you're not getting much there. And so the treaty that you mentioned, well, guess where it got introduced? It got introduced into the Conference on Disarmament with full knowledge that the Conference on Disarmament was not going to be able to move forward on it because the Conference on Disarmament can't move forward with anything. You then have sort of a European approach. And the European approach was, well, we know what we need is something that's non-legally binding. Because if it's legally binding, it's a multilateral treaty, it's got to go through the Conference on Disarmament. So Europe says, we're going to do a code of conduct. This will be nice, a code of conduct. It's not legally binding. We're going to talk about being responsible in space and doing all these wonderful things. And they have 3 consultations, and it looks like they're going to get a success. And around, again, I think this is 2014, they have they call for a negotiation at UN headquarters in New York, and it implodes immediately. And it implodes because, well, you have a couple of different things going. First, the EU and their wisdom sent out this, like, these are our rules, like, these are the rules. And so they don't even, like, let the states that show up sort of have this preliminary negotiation about how they're going to do the negotiation. But on day one, China and Russia stand up and say that we don't think this should be here, right? We think that it needs to be in the other venue, which is the Conference on Disarmament. And so they've got that opposition. You also have opposition from a good sort of alliance of developing states, because one of the ways that the EU got the United States in the room was to say, okay, well, we'll put the right to self-defense in there. And these developing states said, this shouldn't be in there. Now, from a legal perspective, right, it doesn't matter if it's in there or not. This is non-legally binding. It's not going to take away states' right or non-right to self-defense. But nevertheless, right, if you put it in context with the George W. Bush administration's invasion of Iraq, you have a lot of developing nations that are suddenly a little squirrely about allowing the right to self-defense get expanded anymore. And so this opposition also leads to a breakdown in these negotiations. And literally at the end of day one, they announced that they were no longer in a negotiation, that they were in a consultation. And so that kind of fizzled out and went away. Weirdly, in the first Trump administration, and I say this all the time, it gives me no end of grief that, all right, like I loathe that guy. And in my area, they weren't so bad at policy, right? They were decent, right? And it had a lot to do with, like, there were decent people in there. So towards the end of the first Trump administration, there was this notion that, hey, maybe the U.S. should talk about this at least. Probably not going to negotiate a treaty, but maybe we should talk about it. And so when the UK introduced its UN General Assembly resolution on responsible norms of conduct in space, the United States jumped on board with that. And the United States began to actually engage in this area. Now, that's good, right? I think that this is a good change for the United States. At the same time, it was a little too late, little too late, right? You've already let us go on for 20 years of just opposing any new rules. And so what we end up with is Paros being fragmented across these different places, right? You have it happening at the Conference on Disarmament, or you don't really have it happening there because they can't do a program of work. You have it happening in the UN General Assembly where they adopt these resolutions. And for years, right? You can go look at the resolution voting pattern. It's phenomenal, right? All states agree to it except the United States votes against it, and like Israel votes against it, and then Tuvalu abstains, right? And like that's what it looks like because the United States is putting pressure on at least 2 states not to go in for this resolution. So you spent so much time opposing this that when you come to the table and you say, okay, I want to talk about it now, it's really it's too late. And that, I think, is what we're seeing now with the tensions that are growing. Right, all of these tensions in space are always connected terrestrially, right? Like, so what we're seeing in Ukraine is actually pushing in on the space domain and making us think about that there. So the hopes for Paris right now, I think, are very, very dim, right? I think we're going to continue to see deadlock. And part of this is because I think that the United States, Russia, and China all benefit from a very permissive legal system in space and do not want to see a change on it. If you saw the Conference on Disarmament undeadlock this year and say, okay, we're going to negotiate this treaty, you would see one of these states finding a way to scuttle it. Don't know which one would do it, but one of them would. And so that's the problem with Paris, is that the political will just does not exist to move it forward right now, even though all of the states are going, yeah, I think that's a really good idea.
James, I don't know how to put up the electronic hand. Could I have the floor?
Please, go
Peter
ahead.
Jenkins.
Certainly. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you very much, PJ. Really good talk. I have two questions, really. First, Starlink, would it make a strategic defense initiative much cheaper now than such an initiative would have been in the 1980s? Because you said one of the factors that certainly counted against Reagan's Star Wars was the extraordinary cost of putting 1,600 satellites into space. In other words, can Starlink provide the kind of coverage that was envisaged under Star Wars? And secondly, why does the United States think that having a permissive regime in space is better than having a rules-based regime, provided, of course, it can play a part in agreeing the rules, especially agreeing them with Russia and China? In other words, couldn't there be some defensive motive? Couldn't the United States have defensive reasons for wanting there to be a space regime?
So let me start with Starlink on this one. So Starlink, I want to emphasize, Starlink is not a replacement, or Starlink itself can't deliver what Brilliant Pebbles would, but Starlink shows us the capability of having a constellation of the size that you would need, at least. And so in that sense, right, it's actually probably more SpaceX, the launch company, end of this that makes it cheaper, because they brought down launch costs dramatically over the last 20 years. That said, right, this is still an extraordinarily expensive program if you were going to actually deploy it, right? There is a massive research and development cost that has to come in, right? Like right now, Brilliant Pebbles is some PowerPoint slides with some lovely pictures that people have drawn, but right, like there's a lot more to it than that. And then just it is still, you've got to keep up a rate of launch of launches going. And the other thing that again, I don't know is, like, I don't know what a Brilliant Pebbles satellite would weigh compared to a SpaceX launch, right? Like they do these SpaceX satellites, and I think they do 10 to 20 at a time. I don't know that you could put that number of interceptors onto a single satellite or a single launch vehicle. So yeah, it is cheaper now, and I think it's more technologically feasible now. We're still talking about enormous costs. But don't worry, right? Elon Musk is cleaning up all the change in the US government, and we'll be able to pay for that in no time. Now, second question. Why does the United States oppose, or why do we want the permissive regime? And I think that this goes a bit to sort of just the national psychology of the United States to some extent, right? It's when you're the leader, right? A permissive regime is good for you because you get to lead, you get to make the rules, you get to figure things out as you go along. And I think that a lot of the United thinking on space from the United States at the policy level makes an assumption that we're going to always be the leader, right? We'll always be in charge. We're always going to be the top dog in space, right? Look, the way that the United States pushed, and this is totally unrelated to this, but the notion of space resources was built around an assumption that the U.S. would get there first. Because if the U.S. isn't going to get there first, you've adopted a really bad rule. So I think part of it is caught up in this notion of, well, we're the leader, and so we don't have to answer rules. And this, I mean, it also flows into that idea, right? There's Americans grow up with this libertarian streak that gets hardwired into us, and you can't tell us what to do. We don't want your rules, blah blah, which is not a really great place to be when we're talking about international security. But I think a lot of it is connected to that. Now, at the same time, I think that what we saw towards the end of the Trump administration carried through in the Biden administration is at least this acknowledgement that, hey, we have a lot of assets up there and they're at risk. And I think a lot of this came from the commercial end. I think the commercial sector was saying, hey, if you guys start a shooting war up there, like that's our investment that you're damaging. And so I think that there was some push from them to kind of soften this a little bit, but it is softened, right? It is not a full engagement. The United States is still not interested in a legally binding agreement. They're just willing to talk about norms at this point. That's a massive sea change from George W. Bush and Obama, but nevertheless, right? Like it doesn't get you very far. So I think a lot of it's built on we're the leader and we're going to remain the leader, and I think that some of it's built on we just don't want your rules. But if you really talk to a lot of the military leaders, they would like a bit more regulation, right? Permissiveness does not lead to predictability, and predictability is what they want. They want a stable environment. And as China gets more and more, look, China's a space power now, right? As they do more in space, you would like predictability with them, especially if you're going to spend most of your time painting them as enemy number one.
Mm-hmm. James, if no one else wants the floor and PJ can bear it, I'd like to ask him one more question, and it relates to last year's report about the Russians wanting or planning to put a nuclear weapon or nuclear weapons in space. What does he make of that? Does he think it really is true, or could it be faulty intelligence? And what would be Russian motives, given that their assets in space would be just as vulnerable to a Russian nuclear weapon explosion as American assets?
Thanks, Peter. I might also take the question from the chat. I can see there's one question here from Alfred Jones about a potential proposal for telescopes for monitoring outer space being made in Pembrokeshire in Wales. Where do they fit into the surveillance scenario? So possibly like ground-based verification there. Mm-hmm. And if I might take advantage of my position as chair, I might also add into this question, what is your perspective on open source research in this area and the capabilities of civil society for monitoring the use of space?
All right. So I'll start with that and then round over to the Russian thing. So yeah, I've read about this planned installation in Wales. I was actually living in Wales when it was announced. I used to be at Cardiff. So this is part of sort of an ongoing notion that we need a better understanding of what's in space, right? And so like one of the ways that we do that, the space environment isn't something that we're filming in real time, right? You measure something as it goes overhead, you run it through an algorithm, and you predict where it's going to be the next time it comes by. That's basically what we do. So the more sensors that you have and the more advanced those sensors are, the better you can get at understanding this. The one that's going in Wales is very much connected to national security, and it's connected to this notion of we need this for military. And I think that's why there's about a lot of pushback on this one. Because the question becomes, what happens to that data, right? Is this data that is going to benefit the entirety of space? Or is this information that's only going to benefit national security? And look, the best space information that we have right now comes out of the U.S. Space Force. By law, U.S. Space Force collects this data and actually shares it. You can go and download not the really good data, but you can go download what they call the two-line elements from a place called Track, and you can run your own algorithms and see where things are in space. So it's very much wrapped in this notion of just knowing what we have in space. Currently, the notion of open source research plays into this, right? I mean, there's a great example. Before the United States shot down USA 193, which was their ASAT test in 2008, the satellite, the reason that we knew the satellite was going to re-enter is because a guy with a telescope in South Africa was like, hey, I think that satellite's going to re-enter in a few months, and put it out on the web. And that's how we knew. The question is capacity, right? We have commercial companies that are now trying to do this. It's a question of capacity. And the reason that we get most of this from U.S. Space Force is not because they built a space surveillance system. It's because we built a nuclear surveillance system, and we're using it to look at space, right? But they are trying to change that and actually build purpose-built things for this. So yeah, it's all about like just having better intelligence, and even the shift from space situational awareness to space domain awareness as the new term, right? That is very much connected to sort of military thinking, right? A domain is a military thing. But let me then end on this the Russian the Russian thing. Look, it could be faulty intelligence. I have no idea, right? Like this is something that I could very much see Russia floating out there to see if somebody would pick up, just to add a little doubt in, right? At the time, Starlink was getting big, right? Like you wanna add doubt in. But it could be true, right? Look, hours before Russia invaded Ukraine, they bricked a bunch of Viasat terminals. It wasn't a cyber hack in space, but it was of the space infrastructure on the ground. So it could be very much that. But you also have to think about the strategic elements of this. And again, my caveat, not a strategist, not a strategic studies person, but you've got to think about the war that Russia thinks it might fight and the war that the United States thinks it might fight, because I do think this is a Russia-US dynamic here, right? Russia is preparing for a land war. They're preparing for a war where they can bring land infrastructure with them and be able to set up communications. They don't necessarily need to depend on satellites to do that. Their adversary, the United States, is most likely fighting a war from across an ocean. Satellites are really important to that, right? The biggest military user of satellites is the Navy, just because you got to keep those ships talking to each other. So from a Russian perspective, yeah, you might give yourself a black eye, but it might be a black eye worth having if it actually allows you to have victory in your chosen theater, right? Russia has no desire to try to like come and attack the US mainland. So they are less concerned about having space assets. The United States is trying to project global force across the world. You got to have space assets to do that, or you just can't have a conversation with your admiral who's sitting in the Indian Ocean.
Thank you very much, PJ. We're just coming up on time, and I am posting some of your recent publications in the chat just for our audience today. I think we're closing it. Yeah, we're out of time for today's session. So I'm just going to say thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your really interesting presentation and how many questions you've taken today. So on behalf of everyone at Pugwash and who attended today's session, thank you very much. I also want to thank everybody who came to join us for today's session. I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon at our next event. Glad that everybody was able to join us today. And I can also see just a quick plug from Peter Burt from Drone Wars online conference, Stop Tech Wars, which is taking place the 22nd of February 2025. I would also like to take this opportunity to promote our own conference with Student Young Pugwash, which is taking place on the 15th of March at King's College London. And we will be promoting that hopefully in the chat. If I could ask Tim if you have a link to that, if you could drop it into the chat just to promote that, please. And if today's audience would like to promote that to young people who you think might be interested in attending, we would very gladly appreciate if you could share that. So once again, thank you very much, PJ, for today's presentation. I hope everyone has a nice afternoon. Thanks all.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.